It is 539 BC, and the most powerful king on earth is standing at the edge of a river, staring at a city he cannot take. Cyrus the Great has already conquered most of the known world. He has toppled kingdoms, swallowed empires whole, and never once been stopped. But here, outside the gates of Babylon, he is completely stuck. Because Babylon does not have walls, it has a wall so absurdly massive, so impossibly thick, that ancient writers were convinced it had to have been built by gods, not men. So Cyrus does something no one expects. Now, before we get into Cyrus and his absolutely unhinged plan, there is something you need to understand about Babylon itself, because most people picture it as just another ancient ruined sand and rubble, and maybe some hanging gardens, but that is not what Babylon was. Babylon was the ancient world's New York City, the largest, most advanced city on the planet, sitting at the center of the most strategically valuable land on earth, which meant every empire in history wanted it, and almost all of them tried to take it. And for most of Babylon's early history, they succeeded. The very first walls around Babylon went up around 2000 BC, during what historians call the Old Babylonian period. These were not the legendary fortifications that made the city famous. They were modest defensive structures built by rulers who understood that a city this wealthy, sitting in the flat open plains of Mesopotamia, was basically an open invitation to every warlord and conqueror within 1,000 miles. And those conquerors did not hesitate. The Hittites swept in around 1595 BC and ransacked the city so completely they carried off the sacred statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, stripping the city of its divine legitimacy as much as its gold. Then the Kassites moved in and ruled for centuries, not as liberators but as occupiers, reshaping Babylonian culture under their control. And then came the Assyrians. The Assyrians are worth pausing on because they are central to understanding why the walls became what they became. The Assyrian Empire was the most brutal, most methodical military machine the ancient world had yet produced. They had siege engineers, battering rams, iron weapons, and a deliberate policy of terror. They would deport entire populations, burn cities to the ground, and leave pyramids of skulls outside city gates. As a message to anyone watching, they sacked Babylon multiple times. But the moment that changed everything came in 689 BC. That was the year the Assyrian king Sennacherib did something that shocked the entire ancient world. He did not just raid Babylon, he erased it. Sennacherib was furious at the city, which had rebelled against Assyrian control one too many times, and he decided to make an example that no one would forget. His armies tore down the temples, the palaces, the walls. They flooded the ruins by diverting canals over the rubble, and Sennacherib declared that the city should never be rebuilt, that Babylon should simply cease to exist. Even the ancient sources that recorded this moment struggled to describe the scale of the destruction. Babylon, the eternal city, the navel of civilization had been wiped from the earth. But here is the thing about Babylon. It came back. Sennacherib's own son, Esarhaddon, reversed his father's decree and began rebuilding the city. And when Babylon rose again under the Neo-Babylonian Empire that followed the collapse of Assyrian power, the memory of what Sennacherib had done did not fade. It calcified into something harder than brick, into a vow that this would never happen again. By the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire had finally torn itself apart, and Babylon stood at the center of a new Neo-Babylonian Empire, stretching across Mesopotamia and beyond. And its greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar II, had a singular mission. He was going to build walls so formidable, so impossibly overwhelming, that no army on earth would ever again look at Babylon and see a city worth attacking. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years from around 605 to 562 BC, and he poured the wealth of an entire empire into the project. And when you understand what he actually built, the numbers are so absurd, they almost sound fabricated. The outer wall of Babylon ran for roughly 18 kilometers, forming a complete perimeter around the city. But it was not a single wall, it was a system. The outer defensive wall was around 7 meters thick, made of fired mud brick, so dense and hard it was nearly indistinguishable from stone. Behind that outer wall sat a second inner wall, even thicker, reaching up to 23 meters wide in sections. that is wider than a modern 6-lane motorway, and between the two walls ran a deep moat filled with water fed directly from the Euphrates River, which itself split and flowed through the city, making Babylon essentially an island surrounded on every side by water and brick. The engineering was as important as the scale. The bricks were fired at extreme temperatures and laid with bitumen, a natural tar that acted as both mortar and waterproofing. The walls were not flat, featureless slabs. They were built with towers every 44 metres protruding outward so that archers inside could fire down the length of the wall in both directions. Simultaneously, there was no blind spot, no safe approach, no angle from which an army could move against the walls of Babylon without being completely exposed the entire time. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus visited the city and described the walls with a disbelief that still comes through clearly 2,500 years later. He wrote that they were so wide a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Ancient writers included the walls of Babylon among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and given that they were competing with the pyramids of Giza, that comparison alone tells you everything, and Nebuchadnezzar's gamble worked for a generation and then some. No major power dared attack the city. The reputation of the walls was so absolute, so total, that Babylon entered a golden age. Its scholars built the foundations of mathematics, astronomy, and written law. Its population swelled to somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people, making it the largest city on earth. Its traders moved across the known world, and nobody with serious military ambitions even bothered drawing up plans to assault it. Sennacherib had tried to bury Babylon forever, and instead had created the most indestructible city in history. But then Cyrus the Great arrived, and the walls met the one man, clever enough not to care about them. Cyrus was the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and by 539 BC, he had already swallowed the Median Empire, the Lydian Empire, and most of Central Asia. He was not a conqueror who smashed through things. He was a conqueror who found ways around them. But Babylon was different. Whoever held Babylon held the symbolic heart of the civilized world, and Cyrus needed it. His armies camped outside the walls, and the Babylonians were not afraid. They had grain stores to last decades, and water flowing through the city from the Euphrates. The walls could not be scaled, could not be battered down, and a siege would outlast the patience of any invader. So Cyrus looked at the river. The Euphrates entered Babylon through a gap in the northern walls and exited through a gap in the south. It was the city's lifeline, and Cyrus saw it as its one exploitable weakness. He ordered his engineers to dig a massive network of diversion canals upstream, redirecting the Euphrates into surrounding marshlands and irrigation channels, draining the flow that ran through the city's heart. The operation was colossal, and it had to be executed quietly enough that the Babylonians inside would not have time to prepare a response, and Cyrus chose his moment carefully. It was the night of a great festival inside Babylon, the Babylonian feast of Belshazzar. According to ancient accounts, the court was celebrating. The king and his nobles were drinking from the sacred golden vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem. Torches burned across the city, music filled the streets. The mood was one of absolute security, because why would anyone be afraid tonight? The walls were right there. While the city celebrated, Persian engineers worked in the dark. Upstream, the water levels in the Euphrates riverbed running through Babylon began to drop, not all at once, not like a flood in reverse, but steadily, quietly, and when the water fell low enough, Persian soldiers waded in. They moved through the riverbed where the great river had always flowed, following it straight under the walls using the same gap the Euphrates had always used. The city had never thought to fortify it proper. Why? Because why would you close the door your water supply walks through? By the time the guards at the inner gates realized what was happening, Persian troops were already inside the outer wall, and then the inner one, the city that had stood for centuries, that had survived Hittites, Kassites, and the full fury of the Assyrian war machine, fell in a single night while its king was at a party. The walls had never been broken. Not by force, not by siege. Cyrus had simply found the one opening in the greatest fortress ever built and walked through it. The city did not burn. Cyrus made sure of that. He issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed in cuneiform that historians sometimes call the first declaration of human rights. In it, he declared he would not enslave the Babylonians, would not destroy their temples, would honor their gods, and would free the peoples Babylon had deported, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. The man the walls were built to stop turned out to be the most merciful conqueror the city had ever seen. And then 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great stood at the gates of Babylon in 331 BC, and the city simply opened its doors. He did not need to test the walls. He had heard what they were, and he was smart enough to know better. Babylon surrendered, and Alexander was so overwhelmed by what he found inside that he began planning to make it the capital of his entire empire. He would rule from here, he declared, from the greatest city in the world. He died in Babylon in 323 BC before he could see that plan through, but the walls were still standing above him when they buried him. Parts of the walls and the famous Ishtar Gate still sit in the earth in modern Iraq. Fired brick, locked in bitumen after 2,500 years. A city that refused to stay dead, the walls of Babylon were built because one king erased everything, and the people who came back swore it would never happen again. And when those walls finally fell, it was not to an army, it was to one man who simply moved the river,